Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Brazen Folly Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support the channel on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. Today is episode 10 of the Political Commentary, where we're covering Trump's domestic policies. So that's a lot to talk about. We're here to give you a broad overview, okay? So we're not going to go, each one of these could be a video on its own, and probably will be someday. So let's start with the big picture, right? So I would argue that the forces behind Trump, supporters such as the Zionists, the tech industry, the tech oligarchs, and other more recent wealthy power centers, not like the old New England money, which the blue bloods, which what Keith Preston would call the Sunbelt capital types from like the southern states in California, they are more behind Trump. And the reason why I think we're seeing these harsher or tougher law and order policies, which broadly, they cover three areas: organized crime, left-wing activism, and immigration, is because the actual infrastructure that keeps this country going, the physical infrastructure of industry and technology, and the physical infrastructure of finance capital, all of that, needs a stable environment, an environment that's not prone to shocks, that's not prone to direct damage to the property itself. As America becomes more fragmented, chaotic, and small-scale violence spreads across the country, either in the form of like shootings like we saw in Minneapolis earlier this year, or in the terms of things like, say, the more political activism from like the left, like Antifa and things like that. It creates a unstable environmental situation where those people don't like it because it hurts their bottom line. It hurts their ability to consolidate what they have. Now, I think because of that, that's why Trump appears to have the upper hand at the moment, because those people want to keep this going, right? They want it. And so Trump is going to be their law and order guy. And that's an easy thing for a red candidate to do. Republicans, going back to Nixon, are known for being law and order. So that's a really easy sell, right? And so from their POV, Trump is being given the go-ahead, right, to have a tough law and order, even going so far as deploying National Guard into the country internally to crack down on crime. And of course, he wants to deport the immigrants. He wants to fight the cartels, and he wants to deal with the left-wing activism. So on the meta level, I think the issue with the cartels, which has been an issue for like since the 80s, right? The thing is, what took so long? Why did it take essentially 40 years for the U.S. government, both internally in the United States and then externally in places like Mexico and the saber rattling over Colombia, to do anything with regards to boots on the ground? I think partly the threat hadn't gotten to where it is now. I think what this tells us is that the elites view this threat as extremely dangerous in a way that they didn't under Clinton, that they didn't under George W. Bush, and that they didn't under Obama. In fact, I mean, Obama's track record is a joke, right? Fast and Furious. You actually give the cartels guns. That's literally insane. That's insane, right? So what I see this as telling me is that the elites view this as a very serious crisis now, because these cartels are armed and they're dangerous and they're making a lot of money and they're making inroads into the United States. Now, the other thing too, though, is this is an effort to crack down on things like fentanyl and opioid abuse. The real meta question is, why are Americans just frying their brains on drugs? They weren't doing this in the 40s. The real reason is because America is a country that's falling apart. If it was well-adjusted and normal like in the 40s, you wouldn't have people tripping out on drugs and crack and gangbangers shooting up in the streets. So this is a representation of the American principle of rather than dealing with it before it happens, rather than preventative care, it's treatment, right? Americans just don't believe in preventative care for some reason. They used to, but not anymore. So this is a very good example of the way Trump is treating organized crime, of this, antecedent quality of dealing with it after it's happened. Now, sure, attacking the supply lines and arresting personnel and arresting or assassinating cartel leaders will all help. But ultimately, the real way to stop all this is to figure out why Americans are buying all this stuff, right? And maybe improve the country to where it was in the 40s, where you didn't need to do all that. But that's that. The other really interesting meta issue here is the left, right? He's a declared Antifa terrorist organization, and he's trying to arrest other left-wing activists. Now, this is really interesting, right? Because under George W. Bush in Trump's first term, this did not happen, right? Antifa goes back to like the 90s. So, we had Republican presidents who tolerated the presence of Antifa, but didn't do anything to crack down on it. And what that tells me is that, and we mentioned him before here on the political commentary, but also on the roundtable stream, Caleb Maupin. And I think that his theory of an elite, cold civil war, if you will, right? It's not a hot war yet. It's a elite struggle right now, is true. And so you could view this as Trump taking pawns off the board, right? These people, these activists, the people that fund them, the people that lead them, the people that organize them, they can be seen as pieces on a chessboard. And he's taking those pieces off the board in ways that are direct, right? In a way that Bush didn't do. And in fact, even Obama arrested a lot of Antifa guys during Occupy Wall Street. Bush and Obama, and then Trump's first term, and certainly not Biden, they didn't take these stances. And so without the behind-the-scenes man behind the curtain political support, Trump could not do this. So who are, the people who are saying, here's the green light, let's go, what I believe is partially representative of this civil war. Because they're thinking, well, hey, look, if we can take these pieces off the board, then we can just, do what we want. But the other thing that shows us that this is still a part of what I call the culture war, and the way I define the culture war for those who don't know, is a frozen conflict between counter gangs. And so the real issue is just go after Soros, right? Trump won't do that. Trump won't go after the big liberal money direct. See, the most efficient way to get rid of Antifa and all these people is go for the big liberal money that funds it. But he's not doing that, which means that this tension, while it's increasing, is still contained. They're not arresting each other yet. Because to be honest, if the government were to arrest members of this elite class that, is behind the parties, we're in a whole different game now. Like it's not the old game of, we're on the same team but with two different factions. It's going to be one step closer to, direct violence between these groups. And I don't think anybody wants that yet, but this still is a major move and pivot and shift away from what we've seen over all those years. And immigration also, Trump could not leverage the support in his first term to take proactive steps against the immigrants that he wanted to, that his support base wanted him to, right? So in that sense, again, there's a pivot in the classes behind him. So that'd be like the tech class, the Zionist class, and other groups who think that these people are now actually a real threat. And this is where I think, on the one hand, Keith Preston is correct that October 7th, 2023 sort of broke the Jewish woke coalition, because now the woke people are like, well, you're white and you're oppressing Palestinians. And so the Zionists are like, boop, they move over to Trump, and Trump is now given the green light by them to do whatever needs to be done, right? And the big tech crowd, their goal is to automate everything, right? That's how they're going to solve the labor issue. You just automate everything. Whether they can do that or not is a whole separate question, but that's what they want to do, right? And so with these two groups, and presumably others, but those are the two that I'm most familiar with and most aware of, Trump is being given the permission, if you will, to take these kinds of actions in the way that he wasn't in 2016. And it shows us that the political coalition that had arisen against him in 2016 on both the Democrat and Republican side is essentially completely fallen apart. Florian.
Yeah, many good points. I think, the tech oligarchs, they are more behind Trump than behind the left. the physical infrastructure needs a stable environment. We see the opposite happening in I would say strongholds of left-wing oligarchs like Germany or Europe, right? Germany has basically been in a weird about phase, been destroyed economically by the supposedly conservative Chancellor Merkel in 2011 or so, whereabouts thereabouts, um, by doing something that the Green Party always wanted, getting rid of all the nuclear power, which was a catastrophic move, but not modernizing nuclear power, but just getting rid of nuclear power. So Germany entered a degrowth environment powered by a supposedly conservative chancellor, right? So it may well be, as you said, that the oligarchs that are behind Trump or associated with Trump, they want the physical infrastructure, economic infrastructure to stay as it is, right? There's also competition with China. Keith has pointed out sometimes this like the thought that we need to fight China, and you need to have good energy reserves for that at a minimum, right? Um, so and then the National Guard thing, where Trump is using the National Guard to go into sanctuary cities, I think that has been allowed in the past as well. Like when Eisenhower sent the National Guard into Arkansas to push through or to make sure that the Supreme Court ruling got enacted when some black students that had sued against they want to be let into the school, and the white people wouldn't let them into the schools, and so the Supreme Court decided basically they have to do that, and they refused. So Eisenhower sent the National Guard and basically held the native population at bay with, or the white population at bay with bayonets. Pretty strong pictures if we look at that. And then, of course, Lincoln's, the Civil War. Lincoln would also invade the southern states, right? Despite the southern states attacking Fort Sumter, he would still invade them with a federal army. And one could say maybe that was. I heard another idea that the southern states were more allied with Britain. So maybe that was also a thought that we fight against the British influence. That could be. But in the U.S., has always been the case. If the federal government thinks a policy needs to be followed through, they send the army in to any state that thinks otherwise. That's just what happens, right? I'm actually surprised that the sanctuary states have been allowed to operate that long, right? Because that's basically a low key permanent rebellion of those states, right? They are not letting the federal government enforce immigration law. That's a rebellion against the power of the federal government. Then the declaring Antifa a terror organization, that has been a long-standing goal long-standing maybe not, has been the goal since 5 to 10 years with the new right. But I also, and has never been done before, maybe also because uh, you never got the feeling that the Antifa would be let off with a slap on the wrist, right? In the past, when there were riots, then even Antifa was subdued, and now it seems like they're not anymore. They're given kind of free reign, together with the notion of sanctuary cities that works all together. Usually, the politicians that let Antifa operate, they are also in favor of being an sanctuary state, and they are against federal immigration enforcement and so on, right? So basically, the whole leftist blob complex. So that could also be a reason that Trump is now going against Antifa, and he may still go until the bigwigs in the background, right? But if you want to use the RICO laws, you first need to squeeze the small fish that they talk, and that you then have more evidence against the people in the background, the people behind the curtain. So we could still see him going against the oligarchs. That would actually be a sight to behold. I hope he still does it during his term. And yeah, you're right. You're right. With the desire of big tech to automate everything, I'm still not entirely sure they're really wanting to automate everything because there are reports that AI replaces low-level work. Well, the reality is that many companies don't quite put AI in place of employees, but they put H-1Bs in place of Native American citizens or like American citizens, right? And so in a way, I also read a report whereby usually the Indians, they are sent here on an H-1B visa by some H-1B visa mills. They basically get through all the legal problems, and then they have like a bunch of Indians that they then send out to companies. They keep like 20 or 30% of what the Indians get as an income, and the Indians are basically grueling in with like $7 per hour or something like that. That of course in total undervalues underbids American labor, and that's a big problem. But I think sooner or later there is going to be AI replacing the low level menial work. It's a bit similar to, I see that issue of immigration, low 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 ability immigrants that can basically only do very rote coding tasks and can basically only pluck strawberries and in very different incarnations. I think that's a little bit akin to the situation of civil war in the 19th century, right? The North had already developed machinery that had them doing many jobs much easier than with human labor, and the South was still using slaves for human labor. That kind of held back an automation and kind of held back the Industrial Revolution for the United States, right? And we are at a similar situation. Immigrants hold up the if you allow companies to get illegal immigrants in or low qualified immigrants to do the menial task work, you block automation in a way, right? Because you have slaves doing it for you, and you don't need to automate anything, which would be on a total cheaper.
Yeah. So let's look at, because this is where the issue of the deployment of the National Guard comes in, combating organized crime. So one of the things is Trump has been using the FBI initiative called Operation Summer Heat to target violent crime in U.S. cities, with the focus on arresting high-profile offenders. So we have Kash Patel, FBI director, has emphasized federal coordination in combating narco-criminal activities, deploying the federal guard to urban areas for enhanced policing. You see, this is really interesting, right? I mean, we've had, basically no-go zones in cities for a long time now. And, where the police don't go and the National Guard, for example, it was used in the early 90s to fight the LA riots, but that had just kind of taken over the whole city, right? Something had to be done. The issue with this, right, is this isn't so much a high-profile riot in a major city. It's going after these quote no-go zones, which is kind of it's a very much more aggressive pivot, and it's in need of an explanation because we just didn't see that before. Again, I think for whatever reason, these people view these organized crime syndicates as a serious threat, far more serious than before. Because, the other thing too, I think the other reason why this is happening now is the left just had this stupid fetish for, rehabilitating, murderers and, sexual assault perpetrators and all sorts of terrible people, as if, and the real crime, right, would be to execute the violent criminal, which any government in the world who's not insane knows that that's what you have to do. That's just what governments have to do. I think what we're seeing is like the complete death of the ideology of post-war American liberalism. Because what was holding back the hand of people like, say, Reagan or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or Obama? Well, the post-war liberal view of law and order and guilt and judgment. And, you go back to America in the 20s or in the 1870s, they're just going to hang those guys. If you're guilty, you're dead. That's it. We're done. We're not going to play this game anymore. And I think what happened is the physical assets were there to do this, but the will wasn't. And for whatever reason, the will's here now. And I think one of the reasons why the will is here now is we're seeing the death of the post-war liberal view of jurisprudence and rehabilitation. Using the Alien and Enemies Act of 1798, we have Operation Aurora to further dismantle criminal networks. Now, some of the challenges raised against Trump doing this, one is legal battles in the courts, claiming that it violates federal laws, including posse comitatus. That's one. Another one is partisan accusations. Trump is targeting blue cities. Trump is crossing the Rubicon. This is because and we're dealing with. Actually, this is immigration and crime because it's the National Guard is being deployed for all this, and then public and ethical concerns, broader worries worldwide. Now, of course, with the deployment of federal troops against organized crime, that should be just, whatever, right? That should just be normal. Deployment of resources that you need. Because if the police can't handle it, then you're going to have to do something else and raise the level of escalation. Now, immigrants, the reason why the Democrats are saying this is because they have become the party of capitalism and they want to protect. So capital brings in immigrants to drive down the cost of labor. It's the easiest way to reduce expenditure costs. And the Democrats, who used to be the party of the working man and strong unions and border control, are all gone. And they built after the 60s, they built this political coalition with immigrant minorities as a voting bloc. Now, if Trump takes these people out, that's a political body blow. Like their entire electoral platform just collapses if he does this. And so that's why they're upset. Now, of course, there's just, hey, we need to, get rid of these criminals, illegal aliens. That's from Trump's perspective. And that can just stand on its own, right? And so what Trump is kind of doing here is forcing the Democrats into a position where they look really bad. It's like you are defending these people who are criminals. They violated the laws of the United States to get here. Your entire history from Jefferson until, I don't know, JFK was, pro-working American man. And now you just threw that out the window. And now you have to, play these games, right? And of course, when George Herbert Walker Bush deployed U.S. forces and National Guard forces to fight the LA riots, there was bipartisan support for that. That wasn't seen as a Rubicon, but that was because there was still more of a consensus political arrangement back then. It's not like today where this is going on. And one of the things you'll see with people who play these games with the Constitution is that there are, like, for example, libertarians would do this with, like, say, the Civil War. They would say that when Lincoln suspended the right of, free dissent, that was illegal. The Constitution actually makes allowance for that in the original draft. It's not, for such emergencies. So it's not like that was just completely made up out of thin air. It's actually in the Constitution. And so these are, niche cases. Now you could then make a prudential judgment and say, well, is this correct or not? Yeah, that's a whole different thing. And so with the deployment of the National Guard, the other thing that I've been reading about too is that different states have different, like, stand down orders or mobilization orders for the National Guard. So that also means that, it's not quite nullification, where, like, that was a big libertarian talking point like 20 years ago. We're going to nullify the federal government having a state failing to do what they were told to do. A good example was Massachusetts in the War of 1812. They didn't raise the militia. And so they were in this weird limbo where they didn't raise the militia to fight Britain. And there were some stuff that, like, say, Tom Woods would point to where northern states would not comply with federal mandates to, use their local police to arrest runaway slaves and send them back because of the Dred Scott decision, send them back to the South. It's not quite nullification, but but like you said about sanctuary cities, though, Florian, this is a trend which could eventually lead to nullification.
Nullification of what exactly?
Well, of the federal government, right? So a nullification crisis is when the state says that we are not going to comply with this federal order, right? A classic example would be some of the northern states who refused to arrest runaway slaves because of the Dred Scott decision.
Yeah, that was basically then later on. That was later on then solved by the outcome of the Civil War. No, wait, Dred Scott was after the Civil War, of course. No, wait, it was not. It
No,
was before,
Dred
right?
Scott was before, right?
Yeah, yeah.
No,
So
yeah.
it was clean. It was basically made. It didn't matter in the end anymore, right? Because they fought on the side of the Union, and that was that. So I think if you have a government and there are, like, I don't know, dozen states in open, like, low key rebellion against you, are you going to send the troops everywhere in and clean up? It's like a whack-a-mole a little bit, right? So you wait until you find the biggest lever you can pull, and then hope the rest of the states will fall in line. Like, cleaning up Chicago, Washington D.C., other cities is like a pretty big impact, because it's very apparent to everyone that there's large swaths of lawlessness in those cities, right? And I mean, Chicago gang violence is just something that everyone kind of accepts, right? Yeah, everyone kind of knows that there's gang violence in Chicago, and so going against that is a very clear. That you can make a very clear argument for that. And it's very persuasive to make an argument that you need to clean up that city because it's really bad in there. And also, I think the notion, or the observation, that Newsom was able to clean up San Francisco within 2 days when Xi Jinping came visiting, that is also astonishing, and it shows you that it's just bullshit what the Democrats say. Oh, we can't do anything against the crime, blah blah blah. No, you want to let this happen because it's your favorable political outcome in that situation. You don't want to change a working system, and even though it's dysfunctional, but it's kind of working for the Democrats. Um, so yeah, the interesting thing is, there is not really big of a protest against what Trump does. Yeah, there are clashes with ICE on the street in Portland also, and so on. But these No Kings rallies, like the big thing over the last weekend, yeah, it was sort of there, but it was more like a storm in a teacup. It's not comparable with the Pussyhead riots of 2017, 2018. In big cities, you still got like what, like 30,000 people coming together in a big city. That's not really much, right? So somebody said that, I forgot who it was, but somebody mentioned on X that these No Kings protests might have just been training grounds for for left wing military or paramilitary groups, or general left wing organization. They want to see how you can mobilize your people, where are some choke points, what you can do. But even then, if you don't have many participants, it doesn't have that much value as a military training. Maybe it has, I don't know, but it seems like the momentum isn't there really. There's no real desire by people, and people are still tired from the riots and from the BLM marches in 2020. People are just very, very tired about that. I think the desire for rioting is gone for the next a few years at least. But you said something very interesting, which was uh, that George Herbert Walker Bush deployed the National Guard, and that was a common consensus. But what happened then, soon thereafter, you had the O.J. Simpson verdict, right? O.J. Simpson, there's kind of like big, like overwhelming evidence that he did kill his estranged wife and her lover, and they didn't convict. And so I think at that point, that was like one of the instances from which the left has learned we can use racial issues as a winning issue, right? It became then, that's one thing that Obama officially didn't run on, but then very, very strongly ran on that everyone who criticized Obama was basically suspected of being a racist, and arguably the race relationships in the United States have deteriorated since 2008. I wasn't here much before. I haven't like, much before 2008. I haven't really seen uh, seen much of those racial relations, but it seemed to be everything was fine since I was here since 2005. And then all of a sudden, after Obama was there, you had all these like grievance groups, and then you have this culminating into the, oh, I forgot the, well, there was there was the Trayvon Martin incident in Florida, and then there was these riots in several cities in St. Louis. Wasn't there a riot? Yeah, because there was this gentle giant who attacked the police officer, and the police officer shot him, and that was seen as oppressing black people, and then these riots broke out. But even the George Floyd thing, where where the officer kneeled on George Floyd's neck in a prone position, and pretty sketchy to say that he is guilty of murder or manslaughter in that case. But the police has used the prone position in similar positions against white suspects as well, and nobody says anything. There was actually a white guy who was like having a schizophrenic episode or a paranoid episode and being on drug, and he was basically somewhere along the road. There was like the police officer had him in prone position, and he died, and nobody talked about that. So it was all like framed in a very racial context, right? And so I think that started with the OJ verdict and has been continued by Obama and other people.
Yeah.
So now sending in the National Guard there's no consensus for that anymore, because the Democrats use that as an efficient rhetorical device. Oh, there's a racist National Guard or something like, oh, the racist Trump, the fascist Trump. And so then the Trump administration has to design a narrative to counter that, right? It's a huge hindrance if you don't have a common narrative to to throw down local riots. It should be a no-brainer, but it's used as a ideological cudgel to score points against the government,
Yeah.
the government that you don't like in political party.
Yeah. So with regards to left-wing activism, focusing on things like Antifa, right? So September the 22nd of this year, Antifa was declared a domestic terrorist organization. What that does is it allows Trump to expand his operations, so he can target their operations funding and material support. But by making them terrorists, he can have access to other agencies that he would not have if it was just a domestic issue, right? And then also he had the Joint Terrorism Task Force investigate recruitment, radicalization, doxing riots, and funding sources to look for crimes and conspiracies against the right and funding terrorism. He wants to disrupt their financial networks by the Treasury Department, so investigating where that stuff, IRS, revocation of tax-exempt status for these supporting entities, and guidance for financial institutions to report suspicious activities. And then he designates domestic terrorism as a national priority area with grant programs for law enforcement to detect and prevent threats. Now, interesting thing here, right? By allowing the Treasury Department and the IRS to go for tax-exempt status, by removing that, okay, they have to pay taxes. That means that adds a cost to their operations, right? That's going to hurt them. And then also now you can investigate them with more agencies. That's also going to hurt them. Now, the irony here, right? The irony here is from the 90s right down till Biden, you have this idiotic dribble of a vast right-wing conspiracy. I mean, where? I don't see swastikas all over the place. I mean, in the 90s and the early 2000s, the Clintons were just running with this, and it was ludicrous. I mean, the handful of militia types, the real authentic neo-Nazi militias were already dismantled by the end of the 80s. Think of like the Order from the Pacific Northwest. They were already dismantled and subverted by the FBI. It was already gone. Those were real organizations that committed real acts of terror, but they were gone, right? They didn't exist anymore. If they did, they were controlled by the feds. So, but now the whole rhetoric has been pivoted on its head. But this time, it's a red state president, a Republican president, who is going to put teeth behind that, right? So while Clinton or Obama might have, rhetorically appealed to this idea of a vast right-wing conspiracy, They didn't really do a whole lot to, shut down militias. Whereas it looks like Trump is going to do a lot to shut down Antifa and other organizations. I mean, I remember hearing back, oh wow, the Portland riots a few years back. There was the John Brown Gun Club. They might go for that too. I don't know. I haven't followed that very closely. And so probably also BLM. They're probably going to go for them too. It's sort of like inverted, right? These adjacent, amorphous, quasi-disruptive left-wing organizations, which are now being targeted directly, right? Their personnel are being targeted, their lines of income are being targeted in a way that, say Bill Clinton. I mean, he did, attack Waco, so there's that. I mean, that's pretty bad. But that was something unrelated to the quote, neo-Nazi conspiracy. That was just, the ATF being the ATF, right? So there's that.
Yeah, and Ruby Ridge as well.
Yes, Ruby Ridge.
Yeah, it seems that the government under Clinton or the governments before Trump were going after select actors, select events, select groups, and didn't have, and then they basically went against them and used that as, see, there is a right-wing conspiracy, right? And they never went at the problem, to the root of the problem. What they did do though was arming several letter agencies, right? Even the IRS has armed vehicles. I mean, what? That's a tax collection agency. Why do they have paramilitary cars and vehicles? And the ATF, of course, they have tanks and DEA and so on. It's all militarized, but it has never really been used. It seems it was just a big cash grab to justify growth of those agencies. And now Trump is actually using them, at least part of them, to go against the left on a network level. Yeah, that's really very interesting. But even Trump wouldn't have done it. He didn't do it in his first term. Even Trump wouldn't have done it if there wasn't a hard push from the right to do it, because the right has felt it got like always attacked from the left, and then the left, they got a slap on the wrist. But when someone from the right said something bad, he was deplatformed everywhere. And so on, the right has felt basically the left as if they were a boot on their neck. And so now they have their own people back in the Trump administration. Some people that are in Trump's administration, I'm convinced they were very adjacent to the online right in Trump's first term, and they thought about during Biden's term. They thought about what can we do to fight back, and they're doing that now. Like, an administration is not just the president on top; it's the personnel he has, right? If you have personnel that are in favor of striking against Antifa and declaring it a terrorist organization, then you get those procedures that are serving that purpose. You get them expedited. That was, by the way, a problem of the first Trump administration. They had people there they had managers on central positions of the personnel department that would basically prevent pro-Trump people from being hired. It's very subtle, but if you are on a central node in a bureaucracy and you really know how to play the game, you can basically completely counteract the policy so that the figurehead is of the right, and you all have leftists in your government, or that basically are in charge of executing it. So at best, you get a slow response, right? They slow walk everything, or they outright refuse to follow certain orders. So that's now the exact opposite, and that's why Trump is going against those left-wing groups, because now he can, and he has broad support, and I would even say support from a population as well.
Yes, and again, I have to go back to the immigration issue here, because this is where the Democrats really show their colors as complete frauds, right? They've completely, I'm saying this in a nonpartisan sense, they're completely betraying their principles. This has never been the platform of the Democratic Party from, say, Jefferson to Kennedy. Jefferson, Jackson, Wilson, FDR, Kennedy all had strict border controls. Once we had labor movements developing in the 1870s and 80s, they also had strong support for them. Now, prior to that, the support was more populist. So Jackson is a populist, right? He mobilizes mass action against the Bank of the United States. The idea that you would just make your political basis people coming from outside of the country rather than the people in the country, which, whatever you want to say about the Democrats historically, they're, whether with regard to the sincerity of the rhetoric, they did do it. They did, up until JFK, control the border pretty well and support first populist groups and then labor groups. That's all gone now. This is a complete, utter betrayal of everything that they ever stood for. And funny, right? Trump is a Republican, but he's taking positions that are historically associated with the old Democratic Party. So, recently there's been an 85% drop in apprehensions at the border. That would mean a border guard arresting a illegal immigrant coming over. Again, Operation Aurora targets criminal migrants. This is another thing, right? Because of this flood, I'm not saying that everybody that comes over is a criminal, right? But it's sort of like cover, kind of like, okay, think of this. When you're flying a bomber over a target, like you have chaff that you can release if it's not a stealth bomber. And the chaff clouds the radar so that they don't know what to target with missiles. The criminals are using the immigrants as chaff, right? They're not causing it, but they're not letting it go to waste, right? If there's like for every, say, 10,000 immigrants, there's maybe like 5 or 100, to 20 criminals. They're just hiding in that herd, and it's like a needle in a haystack. You're not going to find that, right? And these are dangerous dudes. These Mexican cartel dudes are really bad dudes. And let's see, collaboration with Mexico. So that probably just means putting pressure on Mexico, which the U.S. just usually does. So, but here we can see that Trump is being proactive with the border, with immigration in a way that he wasn't before. And if we use this like a Trump report card, that's very consistent with his first term's goals, which he was unable to do because of the entrenched resistance he faced. So I guess in that regard, his promises on domestic policy look better on his report card than our previous video on his foreign policy, where I would say his report card is actually pretty bad. Florian.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, leftists are destroying or betraying their roots in labor, which were anti-immigration. I think that started with Obama. No, it actually started earlier. I think it started with Reagan, right? Reagan actually encouraged immigration. There was a speech that he gave, the city on the hill, and he encouraged people to come in. Maybe he was just naive. Maybe he thought there's like maybe 100 people more coming in or something like that. But it stands to reason that maybe he was also in favor of more immigration because it's cheaper from a labor standpoint. You have an overabundance of workers, then the labor costs are going down, right? And it sort of like fits with the MEC jobs program. I'm not entirely aware of what Ronald Reagan did to get the economy running again, but as far as I understood, it was with the preference to something like MEC jobs, right? So like in favor of making it easier for people to join the labor force, making it easier for an employer to fire people. He had the famous firing of the air traffic controllers because they wanted to go on strike. And so in that situation, when the employers are also getting this mindset that you don't need to really be there for your workers, you can just fire them. There's no labor union really that will oppose you. Yeah, then you might think might as well just get like cheaper labor in from outside, right? And then basically now you have a development towards a gig economy, which happened at a very bad point for America's economy in that way, or a bad point for America's labor union, because Clinton was much in favor of labor unions. He had backing of labor union. Obama, not so much. Obama won the election 2008. And now he basically didn't have much to do with labor unions. Then you had the recession and the development of the gig economy, that's just something any labor union doesn't really has a place in the gig economy, or at least you would have to define entirely new what the concept of unionization is. So basically, the left has then basically pivoted to saying, okay, we don't care about the native people, the people living here, the citizens. We just let people come in, and we do that because we gain seats in Congress for that, right? They count them in the census, for example. They count immigrants, legal or illegal. They don't ask. So you have like a lot of illegals that put their name into a census, for example, and then the new congressional seats are allocated. And in regions where there's a lot of immigration, you get a lot of seats, and those seats will favor you because you are seen as the party friendly towards immigration, right? So that's how Democrats. That's one way of how Democrats profit from more people coming into the country, and that's maybe what they use as a replacement for having lost the labor union infrastructure.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's part of it. And excuse me. Going back to organized crime, the other problem is with organized crime and immigration, they're difficult to untangle, right? They're okay, and on the one hand, you can view them as two discrete concepts for the sake of analysis, which is fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. But in actual reality, you can't do that because they're so closely tied together with the criminal cartels coming up from Mexico, right? The other angle that I didn't really talk about much was China, right? So a lot of these suppliers are coming from China. And I think actually, too, this is why there's the political will to use the National Guard and hard-handed tactics against organized crime, because this is being spun as a geopolitical strategic threat that China is encouraging and using these people in order to undermine America, right? So from China in the 19th century, there were the Opium Wars, right? So European countries like Britain and France were selling opium to China, and that they create a large addict population that the Chinese ruling class thought was hurting their country. And many people in the United States today view this as sort of like a reverse revenge, where China's trying to force drugs on the up in through America in order to have their an opioid crisis in America, which, whether that's true or not, that's the belief structure for this action to take place. So I do think also direct action against crime is also because it's being wrapped into this China angle in a way that prior organized crime was not wrapped into a national interest, or sorry, international or strategic interest.
Yeah, exactly. Someone told me that when I talked about organized crime and cartel violence, cartels coming into the United States with immigrants, and someone said like, yeah, but what's the difference to the Italian mob? Was the same. Now, it wasn't the same. First of all, the mob was more of an honor culture and wasn't like a wanton violent group, right? They wouldn't. You had to pay. I don't know how they call it. You had to pay protection money or whatever, right? Otherwise, they would smash in the window of your stores. But the Italians were still in line with European culture, in line with the culture that the prevailing culture at that time in the U.S. So they were seen as one of them already, right? And so then there's a lot of unwritten laws that are just explicitly followed, and the mafia didn't have to use indiscriminate violence to make their presence known. This is different with the Mexican cartels. Also, then of course, you have China, as you just said, glomming onto those cartels, and China has basically put their entire how should I say it, the entire fentanyl supply chain. They implemented that on top of the immigration issue. It's very intricate, and actually, it's not an easy issue. I mean, Trump has done something against the cartels, but cartels, they are real paramilitary units. If you want to fight them even on your own soil, they're not just going if you show up with like 2 extra police cars. You need to use massive violence against them to get them off. And since they have probably funding from the CCP, it's going to be even more difficult to get rid of them. So that's going to be a problem that'll stay around for a while. I hope he can get rid of those. And when a lot of immigrants self-deport because the conditions are too bad for them, then maybe also the cartels lose their basic resource. Which I can imagine, if you're an immigrant and you're basically getting into this cartel paradigm, and you basically, friends of yours are cartel runners, and you are bothered by the cartel, you kind of try to go somewhere else, maybe, right? May not be better back in Mexico, but it may not be something where you say the U.S. is the land of freedom and opportunity for me. So if then it is more difficult for you to immigrate, then you may say, okay, I'm going back to Mexico. I'm trying my luck there. At least in Mexico, I know who's who, and then I can navigate the situation better. I think that's the only way long term that will get rid of the cartels. Them just losing their number one cheap resource, which is drug runners and menial labor.
So yeah, as we wrap up, let's sort of frame this whole thing here. The ridiculous clown show that was the culture war, that was intentionally stimulated by corporate and state interest in the United States to break up the monoculture that we had in 1960, is basically leaving the country in a complete state of disarray. We have these organized crime syndicates, which, by the way, when we had a monoculture under FDR, organized crime was crushed. Under Reagan, it was crushed. The culture war took a while to just blow everything up. Even in the 80s, even though the culture war was ongoing, it still was America, because we had the Cold War, the Soviet Union, all that, right? It really started to blow apart after the Cold War because there was no external threat to keep these two groups in line, right? It also leads to these little, pawns on the table, like the left-wing pawns are going to be Antifa and BLM and others, and a right-coded pawn might be like Proud Boys. Why do we even have these organizations? They didn't exist in the 1940s. When the United States was a normal, rational country, we didn't have these kinds of people running around. That's because the culture war created this. And the Democrats, betraying their principles as a party, then started to build an electoral policy based on the overrunning of America by immigrants, which is a complete 180-degree reversal of their original position. This is insane. It doesn't even make sense, because sooner or later a country is going to realize what's going on, and then take action. Now, for whatever reason, it's Trump and it's the Republican Party this time around. But, it doesn't have to be. It could have gone some other way had his story turned out differently. And again, to your point about the organized crime in America, that's why gangsters were seen as folk heroes. They didn't go around shooting innocent civilians. They shot up each other a lot. St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and they shot the police. But the cartels are different. These are like armed paramilitary organizations, which are using immigration as cover. So the overall corporate strategy of flooding America with cheap labor to drive down costs is blowing up in their face, because it's creating both the nullification threat of sanctuary cities and then non-compliant states with ICE not raising their National Guard. Okay. And also higher levels of organized crime, which are, of course, going to be bad for their bottom line, right? This whole clown show has just left America in disarray. And the impression I get is that Trump is working against the clock, because these unleashed forces, right, that the culture war suppressed, right? We were fighting each other for so long, right? We didn't look at these objective issues. And now you can't ignore them. They're just too obvious. Florian.
Yeah, it's tough to imagine where it will go from here. I would say one thing, that if you think that Trump's measures have only little success, I think long term they will have a much more strong effect. I mean, he's in office for 9 months now, something like that. Wait, today is the 22nd of October. Yeah, almost exactly 9 months. And so things are just starting to take root. These things take time. So I am hopeful that there's something that his policies will have more of an effect on the long run. But yeah, we have to see whether in the future someone like Mamdani will also be like FDR and just curb organized crime in the city, or whether he is there to heat up the situation a little bit more. What Mamdani has, what neither Cuomo and Sliwa have, is the freak vote. That someone on X called it that. Freak vote, basically people that are discontent, malcontents. They hate the society they're in. They just want to throw a wrench into society, and Mamdani is that wrench in New York. So I'm not sure how things will develop. I would say on the long run, both left and right wingers will try to establish some order beyond what we have now. But we have to see.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you, Florian. It's always a pleasure having you on. Todd Lewis to the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.